This is The Audience Connection, the podcast where we go into what content actually connects and into why it sticks.
Sponsored by Casual, where behavioral science meets storytelling to build trust for your audiences.
We're your hosts. I'm Ollie Atkinson.
And I'm Lydia Chan. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Do you guys want to hear something that'll change how you think about media spend? How one resonant exposure beats multiple irrelevant ones? Who do we have on the show today, Ollie?
Yeah, well, so today our guest is Bill Harvey. He is the CEO of RMT Labs. He's one of the godfathers of neuroscience. Really excited to have got him on the show. And Bill has spent about 50 years measuring how audiences actually behave rather than asking them what they think. He won an Emmy for his work in audience measurement, helped pioneer the use of machine learning in media before it even had a name, and then consulted for companies including Fox. He's written 2 books on human consciousness and decision making. He's also, this is interesting, he's the person in 2006 who disproved the industry's long-held belief that you could never measure the sales effect of advertising.
Which is fascinating because that is what we're always being asked, right? Like, how are we measuring the ROI of our marketing dollars? What I found really interesting was when you guys talked about the Wharton study at the University of Pennsylvania. Last year, they ran the largest study ever conducted, trying to answer the question of what actually happens in the brain during advertising and how does it differ depending on where and how you watch. When Wharton built their own AI model to evaluate ad quality, it produced a predictive score of 4.6%. But when Bill's context resonance system was added around it, that score jumped to 76%, which sounds like a complete game changer.
Yeah, completely. And if you think this is cutting edge neuroscience research in advertising effectiveness. So it's really important stuff to listen to. And we get into why separating creative from media planning is costing brands more than they realized, why 95% of decision making happens somewhere your focus groups will never reach. And attention as a KPI is a massive red herring, and context alone can take a predictive model from near zero to an order of magnitude better.
And at 83, Bill is one of the sharpest thinkers working on this problem. This one's worth your full attention, which, as Bill will tell you, is not actually the point. So let's jump right into it. Here's Ollie's conversation with Bill Harvey.
Hello and welcome back to The Audience Connection. Today we have a really special guest, a really exciting episode. We have Bill Harvey, who is 83 years old. But when Bill was 5, he was on stage performing with his mother, who was a Ziegfeld Follies showgirl, and his father, who was an orchestra leader. And he felt something on that day. And it's a state, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners will be able to relate to this state, but it's a state where everything became just effortless. And he spent his entire life trying to understand that state and help other people to access it. Now, 50 years ago, Bill started measuring how audiences actually behave instead of asking them what they want. And just last year, one of the world's top business schools, Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania, ran the largest neuroscience study they've ever conducted and discovered that Bill's measurement system predicted brain synchrony better than their own brainwave data. So welcome, Bill Harvey, to the show. And I'd love to unpack this with you and why on earth the marketing world hasn't caught up with it yet. But Bill, welcome to the Audience Connection.
Thanks so much for having me here.
First of all, I'd like to dive straight into it, Bill. So when an advertiser comes to you to, say, optimize their media schedule, the first thing you ask for is the actual ad itself. And in 50 years, nobody has ever asked them that before. Why is that the wrong way around?
Well, the media part and the creative part have been divided since the 1980s. The agencies used to be called full service agencies, and they did the whole thing. And at that time, the idea of integrated marketing was a reality. Now it's just a catchphrase, because it's all become disintegrated and the media people are doing their thing. So it's, silos, bureaucracy, and all of the hazards therefrom. So when people have been doing media optimization, which I've been doing for a long time, they leave out the creative as if these are two separate things, when actually they're abstractions. To the consumer, it's one experience. There's no separation between the media and the creative and the consumer's experience. It's all one thing. Nevertheless, based on the way the workflows and the actual business habits, and that, that affects their perception of reality. And from their lens, you could optimize media ignoring the creative.
Exactly, and it's back to front. So the agencies brief you in on the audience first, but that the creative is the signal, effectively, right?
Exactly. Or to use a horrid metaphor, it's if you're looking at an intercontinental ballistic missile, the media are the rocket, and the payload is the creator.
The other thing we talked about in our discovery session, and the other thing, I'm holding up this book here, Mind Magic, and I loved this book because when I looked at the front cover, I was like, wow, this looks pretty cosmic. And I was kind of a little skeptical going into it. But what I found really fascinating was, the essentially it's a lot about getting underneath, trying to ignore the noise, and getting underneath and trying to understand a quietness. It's quite meditative, and a lot about meditation in there, which I thought was fantastic. But is that, the type of work that you're doing, this resonance media theory, does that connect with the work that you're doing in Mind Magic? Mind Magic feels very personal. It's all about kind of accessing, your subconscious drive, and in that higher consciousness. Are you doing that at scale with resonance media theory? How do the two connect?
Well, it's an interesting question. They connect by the characteristics of the mind being understood better. That in the advertising industry, they briefly realized back in the 1960s that motivation was the driver of all behavior, which is a psychological truism that has been known for a long time. And then they tried to operationalize it using things like focus groups, which weren't strong enough to do anything effective because they were asking people about what they wanted. So they were reaching the conscious mind, but 95% of all decision making happens in the subconscious mind. So they were tapping into 5% of the signal, 95% of the noise, and so it failed. And so they backed away from motivations, and they replaced it with product benefits. They said, okay, well, what we can ask people about is when they buy toothpaste, do they care about decay prevention or tooth whitening or breath freshening and so on? So that was the replacement. So they were still just dealing with the conscious mind. They were also getting, socially acceptable responses because it was questionnaire based. There was also fatigue because they used long questionnaires. And for all of those reasons, they're getting a lot of noise and a little bit of signal, but they weren't tapping into people's motivations. They were far from doing that. So when they write creative briefs, which are to direct the creative people to come up with the actual creative executions, the ads, those briefs have very rarely mentioned the word motivation. Basically, they talk about establishing, we want the people to know that this is a brand that's going to save them money, or it's going to make them smell better, or whatever it might be. But they're not driving to the heart of what a person might be attracted to the brand for, or to the product category for. So they might be talking about breath freshening, where the deep underlying motivation is the desire for sexual experience. And that's why people want to have, a fresh breath, or why some people want to have a fresh breath.
Of course, you don't think about that rationally when you're brushing your teeth. You don't think
right.
This is, for a great sexual experience.
Exactly. In this century, Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize for pointing out that people don't make rational decisions. Jerry Zoltman should have won a Nobel Prize for pointing out the same thing in different ways. P.T. Barnum knew that 100 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
So people aren't making rational decisions, and that's pretty obvious nowadays, you know, when you look at the world situation. So the connection to mind magic is I was always trying to get underneath the stuff that had been put into my mind by other people to try to get to who am I and what do I feel about XYZ. So I started to think about what's underneath all of the noise in my mind to get to the signal of who am I and what am I trying to do and why am I here and what's this all about. I was preparing myself for thinking more broadly about subjects in whatever field I might have been placed in. I enjoyed solving the problems that were coming forward, and I was always going a little too far and bringing in stuff that people didn't want to deal with. So I had to learn how to balance that in order to keep getting a paycheck and so on. But then eventually went out on my own. So that's how I got to the really serendipitous discovery of these 265 value signals. I wasn't setting out to get to that. I was just trying to get people to be able to find the television programs that would really entertain them and, you know, inform them and inspire them. So I created a program recommender, and it was that recommender that found the underlying choice mechanisms.
And you, of course, won an Emmy for this work. It's been quite groundbreaking work, and it still, you know, informs how we view today. Really, like it guides people to what they enjoy. But I think, you know, the story around how you came about those 265 variables is fascinating, especially in a world of AI where everything is instantaneous. You were messing around with AI in years ago, decades ago, really. And can you talk us through the story of how you got from, was it 13,000 psychological words initially, and how you whittled that down to these 265 behavior words, essentially?
Well, I knew what I had to do was to code content, television programs. And at the time, there were only about 10,000 shows on television that got a Nielsen rating that you could report. Interestingly enough, today, when you look at the viewing data, even though we have thousands of choices, hundreds of thousands of choices at any given moment, 89% of all the viewing is to the top 10,000 shows on television today.
I'm sure. Yeah, from my own behavior, I can see that, you know.
So interesting. It hasn't really changed as much as we think it has. But at any rate, I needed something. I couldn't deal with 13,000 items. It had to be reduced. We came up with a method where we could test those 10,000 items in a national probability sample of 10,000 people. And we'd only deal with like 100 at a time to avoid fatigue. And we asked a very simple question, which was, how well does this word describe you? And we gave them a 6-point scale, which was a scale called the semantic differential that doesn't have any description of what's on each of the boxes in the 6-point scale. It just has, at one end of the scale, it had the word me, and at the other end, it had not me.
Right.
So, you know, the first word is conceited. So somebody who was conceited might say, well, I'm probably in the second box there from the right, and so on. So it was easy to do quickly. So you could go through a lot of words in a short time. So when we did that, we found that people clustered, certain clusters of people formed based on the words they used to describe themselves. Other words were more random and attached themselves peripherally to one of the clusters, but they weren't really central to it. So you could, using factor analysis, you could put a quantity on to what extent each word predicted the cluster that it was in. So you could find one word to be a proxy for the cluster. So in that way, we reduced the list to 1,562 words, which was manageable. coded all the shows on television by those words.
If self-reports is unreliable and asking questions is in the rational brain, how did you avoid being misguided at that point? Is that because you're asking people how they identify, or how are you avoiding that in the questionnaire?
Well, we weren't after valid data about who they were.
Okay.
What we were about was just to see what words do people use to describe themselves, even though they might be giving a completely wrong, fake, representation of who they are. They might be doing that consciously or unconsciously. Some people might be sloppy about it and not care. Some people might be doing it, with great concentration to provide the most favorable image of themselves.
Yeah.
But none of that mattered to us. We just wanted to see which words clustered with other words.
Okay.
So that we could, it didn't matter so much to us whether the data were accurate or not, or penetrating or not. But if we could have done it some other way, we would have. But that was the last time at which people's subjective remarks came into our sphere of, the work that we did. So this was at a time when the first new cable boxes and satellite boxes were coming out, where you could have 500 channels. So they were called the digital hybrid analog set-top boxes. And it was roughly, 1993 to the year 2000 when those boxes went from 0 penetration to, 70% penetration. So when we were out there, these were the early adopters of those boxes, the first, million people that got those boxes. So I gave them a program recommender, and I thought it would be particularly useful to them because they had previously had only 68 channels. Now they had 500 channels. They were going to be missing stuff that later on they would say, oh gosh, I wish I knew that was on. I missed that show. I would have at least recorded it on my VCR. My other reason was I thought if we could start by recommending TV shows and people saw that it worked, we could start to ask them about other things, like what's their vision of their happy ending to their life? What would they like their life to be? What are their goals and their aspirations and their dreams? And then we could bring them information, not just in video form, but we could send them emails to give them information that might help them along their career path and so on. That part we never explained to the cable company, but that was the long range plan. We launched it with experts in what was at that time considered to be the cutting edge of AI, which was known as a deductive object-oriented database. It was developed by the organization in France that corresponds to our NASA in the US. So the chief technical officer of their NASA developed this, and we licensed it, and he became a member of the organization of Next Century Media. At any rate, we had this at the time cutting edge AI, and we were using it to determine what program to recommend to people when they pressed the button on their remote control. If they didn't know what to watch, press the button, and the recommender within a second would show on the screen the name of the program and the channel that it was on, so they could go right over to that channel and see that show. And what we found was initially 3% of the people that we made the recommendation to became loyal viewers of the recommended show. And then we were also using machine learning, which by that point in time was pretty common. And it is a form of AI. And it was a pretty mature form of AI even back then. So we used machine learning to determine which of our 1,562 predictors were showing up in the adoption events where they adopted the program as something they watched regularly. And those predictors that were showing up in those adoption events were given automatically a higher weight in the prediction equation, and the other ones were given a lower weight. So as that machine learning set in, the 3% adoption rate went up and up and up, and it hit a peak at 18%, and it wouldn't go any higher. So I asked our CTO, well, how many of the 1,562 variables are still standing and how many have been zeroed out? And the answer was, there's only 265 that are left with non-zero weights. Everything else has been zeroed out.
Wow.
For years, we called them driver tags. And then Dr. Michael Platt from Wharton Neuroscience said, Bill, I think you ought to call them value signals. And I said, I like that. Is there a reason? He said, yeah. He said, in neuroeconomics, which is a field he helped create, we know that within the brain, all choice behavior reduces to a single computation, whether you're choosing cookies or cars or, investments or spouses. Whatever you're choosing, it's the same computation in the brain. And there are certain events that occur in the brain that we can measure. We can see them. They appear at certain places in the brain. The frontal cortex is always involved, but often other parts of the brain are also involved. And when we look at the number of these signals, there are about between 250 and 300 of them. And we call them value signals. And we don't know give them numbers. We don't know what the subjective experience the person is having when value signal number 16 pops up in the brain. We just know that it pops up in the brain.
Okay.
Kind of like putting numbers on asteroids, and we think that what you've got with your driver tags is the semantic and human subjective correspondent to the value signals and the neurological value signals. So you should call yours value signals. So we immediately changed the name to value signals because we hope he's right that, in fact, that's what we've stumbled upon.
And and we'll come on to that's the same Michael Platt that obviously is running this study in Wharton that then you started to come together. So we'll come on to that in a second. But let me talk a bit more about how RMT works in practice. So say I send you an animatic or a script. What exactly are you analyzing and how do you run through these variables?
So right now we use HI, human intelligence, and we're training AI to do it. It's going to take a while. And so the person, the coder, looks at the program or the ad or the website or whatever the content might be. It could be creators, influencers, whatever it is.
So it can be absolutely anything because, we've been working with Paul Zak on immersion, and if he's measuring the oxytocin and dopamine being released, it needs to be a performance, right? You see, that's how he's measuring it. You can't give a script or, there's only so many ways you can do it, but it needs to be a performance. But you can just do it because there's these tags. You can do it on any piece of content, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Including scripts and animatics, which turns out to be crucial because marketers are now producing the final creative days before air, the air date, which is not a problem for us because it doesn't take, a long time to code these ads. But then if we give them feedback about how to improve the ads or where to place the media, they've already placed the media. It's too late. So you do have to do it on animatics and scripts and storyboards and so on. And so the coder, generally though, with programs, for example, watches the show and gets the feelings of a viewer, has the normal human being viewer experience with the show. And so the feelings that are evoked by watching the show, and typically in order to code a show, we watch 3 episodes. The coder indicates whether this particular quality is in the show or not in the show. And when we did this in the 1990s, and we did it completely with automation, we got coefficients rather than binary yes/no signals. And so the main reason we're doing the AI now is to move from a binary classification back into the original grayscale classification, which will be slightly more accurate. It won't be tremendously more accurate because it's already so effective in terms of producing ad-produced sales results and ad-produced brand perception changes and brand equity, brand love changes, and brain synchrony changes. So it doesn't have that much far to go, I don't think, but we'll see. So that's what happens. The HI codes the ad. That's, with an ad less than an hour, few minutes really. And we then run the reports. The reports tell the client, the agency, what are the motivations in the ad, which is always to them, really? Why? Why? And then we break down the motivations, 15 motivations, into 87 need states. And they're very interested in that, although that's a bit overwhelming. They kind of like things in low numbers. 15 is good, 87 is bad, but some people like the 80. And then we keep the 265 words hidden because, we've invested a lot of time and money in this, and we want to monetize it. And we have, I have a nonprofit that I want to fuel with money from this practice. So we don't reveal what the value signals themselves are.
Okay. And so by that, you're then shifting. Those agencies are no longer dealing with demographics anymore. That kind of goes out the window, and you're just dealing with the psychology of your audience. And then they, spend their media accordingly once they find out that psychological profile.
Well, the agencies have one angle and the advertisers have a different angle, but they're similar. They're both trying to get the highest ad sales effect and also branding effect. The immediate sales effect has become the dominant motivation of the advertisers nowadays. Still in all, the long-term health of the brand is not just measured by the people that actually converted in the short term, but it's really more dependent on the seeds that have been planted for future sales by moving people up towards being willing to consider the brand where it was never even under consideration before. So that could be a much more gradual process for certain brands, cars. You don't buy cars every week, so certain things take longer. There's a purchase cycle. The agencies now are moving from what used to be the lowest cost, buying the cheapest cost per thousand was kind of what they were trying to do. Now they realize, no, it's an outcome-based system now. So really, we're not totally replacing demographics or purchaser targets or the movable middle, which is something we helped push them toward in the early OOs. What we're doing is we're combining it with these other ingredients. So we see it more as an ingredient than as a complete replacement.
It's a more in-depth picture that you're kind of layering together these different results to build that picture. I get that. I guess to move it, ground it into a case study, do you have a concrete example of where an advertiser has come to you and then you've revealed these value signals and what they've done differently as a result? Is there anything you can talk about there?
I can. I can't necessarily name names, but Fadi Karam was the senior VP of marketing strategy at this company. So you could probably backtrack to find out which company it was. One of the top 5 companies in the world in terms of advertising. Anyway, he was the guy who said, Bill, you're the first guy in 16 years who sat in that seat over there and said he could optimized the media for me, my media, and asked to see the creative. So we did this study, and it showed, in fact, a 37% increase in purchase intent. He didn't want to do it on sales. He wanted to do it on branding measures.
Mm-hmm.
So he said, so will you do the survey to measure the effect? I said, no, that would be giving ourselves our own report card. We don't want that. You should go to Millward Brown or somebody like that. So he came back and he said, well, Millward Brown's willing to do it. It's going to cost 165 grand. And the sample size is only 165 people. And I said, well, they do really good work. And they're going to be asking the right questions and interpreting it correctly. But he said, but it sounds to me like I'd rather have a bigger sample size. So I connected him with a company called 605. They did 23,000. And it was the study. Usually when you do a study like that, you have to, in the questionnaire, you ask people, well, were you watching television last night? And did you see an ad for a car sometime between 9 and 10 o'clock? And it's very loosey-goosey in terms of commercial exposure. But 605 was using set-top box data to measure the commercial exposure. So it was hard-edged commercial exposure. The only thing that was fluffy was the payoff questions of what did it do to the person in terms of all the funnel levels. And at every funnel level, there were double and triple digit increases where there was the alignment between the ad and the context, the show that it was in. But that isn't what really impressed Fadi. Fadi said, Bill, this one slide you're showing me here is worth all the other slides combined. In fact, it's worth more. And I said, I think I understand what you mean. That was the slide that showed that people who only had one exposure to the ad, a frequency of 1, had significant increases in these measures because they were seen in a program that was resonant with the ad. And in the other group who only got one exposure, there was no effect, which is what you'd expect in most cases. So he said, what that means is I don't need as much frequency. If I have more resonance, I need less frequency, which means less irritation by the heavy viewers who are getting too much frequency and much less money.
Yeah. This is the same thing that came across when talking to Paul Zak, is like there's a lot of wasted spend going on, right? And if you you focus on the neuroscience of it and the behavioral elements of it and the resonance, you can actually save quite a bit. So let's talk a little bit about this the Wharton study. So this is last year. At Wharton they ran the largest neuroscience study they've ever conducted, right? And it was kind of 18 times bigger than any study they've done before. What were they measuring, and why did Michael Platt ask to include RMT? And obviously we've had a lead into this when you were talking about Michael previously, but yeah, tell us the story about this Wharton study.
So Audrey Steele was the executive vice president at Fox for 16 years, I think. Now she's become the president of RMT, but she was there. I have a consulting practice. Fox is still one of my consulting clients. That goes back 8 years now. At any rate, Audrey and I decided that we were going to do a neuroscience study. And she had done neuroscience studies a long time ago with Carl Marcy and had been very happy with the results. And we had been concentrating on more like MMM, market mix modeling type studies, but at scale for many years. And so we decided, let's do something different. Let's interview the various neuroscience companies and pick the best one that will do the best job. So we interviewed everybody. It took 3 months to talk to all of the best people, and we picked Wharton. And the reason we picked them was they had done the most compelling job on comparing their measures against in-market sales results. They, Others had done it, but they hadn't done it to the degree of convincing us that there's really a strong correlation between their measures and in-market sales results. And the purpose of the study was really to measure what goes on in the brain during advertising and what are the differences between different television program types and different digital types. So we had YouTube in there, we had Facebook in there, we had viewing on TV sets, we had viewing on mobile phones, we had viewing of streaming and linear and cable, all different types. And very interesting results. What it showed for YouTube, for example, was that essentially 80% of the time they weren't looking at the ad. They were looking at the skip button or something else around the ad. So anyway, the whole point of the study was that television has more impact on the brain, and it did show that. And then Michael Platt said, I hear you and Audrey talking about this RMT stuff. What is that? And I told him what it was. And I asked him why he was interested. And he said, well, it's getting harder and harder. We at Wharton are not just in academia. We consider ourselves connected to industry and commerce, that the best data are the data that are used in commerce. Most academicians don't get to see that. Most academicians do studies of their own college students, and there's only so much you can do with that. And so Wharton is very involved working with big advertisers and analyzing things for them, drug companies, not just about advertising and marketing, but about products, mental health, all kinds of subjects. And in the marketing area, though, it becomes harder, he said, to get people to use EEG, not so much because of the cost, although that is a factor, but because of the speed. Decisions are being made much faster now. We get people get digital data back in real time, and they change what they're doing in real time. And that's where the market is going. And EEG doesn't fit into that. It takes too long to get results.
How long does it take to get the information back when you're doing an EEG?
Usually, if it's a decent sized study, weeks.
Right.
And if you're doing 840 or 540 is what the study was, it took months, to do it all. So at any rate, he said, so we've always been, in the last couple of years, looking for a proxy, something that could be highly predictive of EEG results, but could be fast. So that's why we're interested in RMT. If it, is anywhere near predictive of our EEG results. And he said, don't get your hopes up. It's not going to be.
Because with EEG, when you get the brain synchronicity, that's a very good indicator towards intent, right? Is that?
Well, what they found was that the synchrony measure has a 91% correlation with in-market sales increases. Mm-hmm. That's in multiple countries. They've tested that in. So a 0.91. And generally speaking, you don't get, there's nothing that you can do in pre-testing an ad that comes anywhere near that. People have been pre-testing ads for a long time, and you're happy if you get some kind of a relationship. Like the ARF in the attention level study found a 0.0006 correlation with sales effect.
Okay.
So, very, very low.
Yeah.
And that's the general experience. Sales results are very hard to predict. At any rate, back in the 20th century, there was a religion within the advertising business that we will never be able to measure the sales effect of advertising. I disproved that in 2006 at TRA, which we then sold to TiVo. But nowadays, people know that you can see the relationship between advertising and sales. It's just very, very hard to predict it accurately. So anyway, Synchrony does do that, but it takes a long time and it costs a lot of money. So he said, so we're going to test to see how well this predicts. Now, I must say that there are two types of resonance measures that RMT produces. One type is the one we've been talking about all along so far today, which is the relationship between the psychological profile of the ad and the psychological profile of the content. We also do matching of the psychological profile of the ad with the psychological profile of the person that we're reaching.
Okay.
So in this work that we've done with Wharton so far, it's just the context, not the person. That we're just starting in that direction now with Wharton. So they did the study and they came back and they said, well, it's better than we thought. We thought, and I thought too, that we would be someplace south of the 4 EEG measures. We wouldn't be in the middle of the pack of the EEG measures. So it turns out we beat 3 out of 4 of the EEG measures. And that was what blew our minds. Mine too. I didn't expect to beat any of the EEG measures, but we beat 3 of them. And we're according to the paper that Michael and his team wrote, it's an academic paper. It says the only statistically significant predictor of EEG synchrony is RMT ad context resonance. Because even their own other EEG measures weren't statistically significant at 0.95, 95% confidence.
So interesting. Like I went to this last month. I went to a research lab in Bristol where they're measuring EEG when people are watching sci-fi films and then changing the edit accordingly. And we were wearing heart rate monitor, the EEG, crown on the head to measure our the signals we were giving off. I kind of understand how the idea that the RMT can beat this. I just don't know how it's possible. Like, because if you're taking these brainwaves that are sort of giving off this synchronized feel, like, are we that hardwired to our behavior that prediction, it feels quite bleak that we are so predictable. Yeah. How is it possible that it beats it?
Well, part of it is due to the inference engine in the brain. And Carl Friston is the neuroscientist who's most associated with this idea of the brain having an inference engine. Mind Magic actually talked about it in 1976. I called it the robot. I knew that there was a part of me that was making automated decisions. Sometimes they were bad decisions. And that's where I wanted my rational mind to stop doing that. But I knew that this was a tendency. And for people who haven't been working on that process their whole lives, for most of us, we're on automatic pilot. And that's why why we're so predictable. Once we all get hip to being more introspective and really making use of free will, we'll become less predictable. And all of these tools, including probably RMT, will become less effective, but will be more effective.
Yeah.
It'll be a good trade-off.
Yeah.
I long for that day.
Yes, society will be better off when we're all meditating and we're more aware of what's going on. Yeah. And walk me through what happened when the result came back. So Michael realizes this. Is there a moment where he was like, oh, this RMT is did he call you? What was the moment when you realized that RMT was predicting this more accurately?
Well, he sent back the data and it blew all of our minds. And then we wound up saying, like, we have to go forward together with this. There's going to be a whole science to understand here, because what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to put people in fMRI machines. That's where you get put in a tube.
Yes. Yeah.
And in the tube, we're going to have a video screen, and we're going to have to play videos for them in there and measure their fMRI while we're doing that, so that we can actually be sure that we're lining up with the neurological value signals. Because you can't do all of that with the EEG. You can do a lot of it. So this is going to take some time. And so we signed a 10-year partnership agreement.
Okay.
And now we're working on developing patents together, co-owned patents. And we're looking at, there's a range of benefits, including mental health benefits and helping society. And Wharton's very interested in that. We are very aligned on the social benefits as well as the commercial benefits. And so they then developed something on their own, which they call the human being digital twin. And they didn't use an RMT. But they were inspired by the work that we were doing to create an AI that took all kinds of signals from the audio and video tracks of commercials. And they used the same commercials that we had used in our Fox study to train this AI. And what they were training it to do was to do what RMT does, to predict. Really, they weren't looking at where to place the ad, just to how good an ad is this going to be? Is this going to be an ad that has a great effect or no effect? So more of an evaluative tool, and maybe also diagnostic to figure out how to make the ad better. So it was really more oriented to the creative than to the media. So it's a little different than what RMT does. And so they wanted to see how good did it do in the marketplace. So they came back and they showed me the results. The R squared was a 0.046, which is modest. But I said, what if you try to put the context effect around it, try to use RMT with it? So they did, and it increased it from 0.046 to 0.76.
Okay.
More than an order of magnitude.
Yeah.
So then we presented that. We co-presented it at the Advertising Research Foundation annual event at the end of March, Audience Time Science. And Michael said, obviously we're going to go forward developing the digital twin together because we need the RMT. In fact, creative shouldn't be judged on its own. It's always going to be seen in context.
In context, yeah.
Context has an enormous impact on whether it's going to succeed or fail. So you can't really separate those things. So that's where we are now. We're working on both the RMT and on the digital twin.
And is the digital twin what you're calling Empath AI, or is that a different title now? Or
well, Empath AI has a bigger scope. What we see Empath AI is encoding ads. Right now, we use HI because AI is so bad at it. But if we want to do work for, let's say, YouTube, now YouTube has 30 billion videos. HI is not going to code 30 billion videos.
Good luck.
you got to have AI to code 30 billion videos. So if we want to work with YouTube, we've got to train AI to be decent, at least usable in doing that job. But in accomplishing that, what we're going to be accomplishing is we're going to be training AI to do what's nearly impossible: compute human feelings. Right now, it can't do that. It tends to overestimate every feeling. And it's got very little discrimination. You don't really see the differences, that person's feeling this and it's feeling that, and it's not the case. So when we finally do get AI to be capable of computing human feelings, everyone in AI is going to need that as a plug-in to their AI. If we're really going to get robots to do stuff and to help old people in their homes and so on, they're going to have to understand human feelings.
Of course, yeah.
So everybody's going to need it. So Empath AI is the plugin that we would make available to everybody because everybody will need it.
And I suppose you need it to be quite a positive human feeling. If you completely clone human feelings directly, then, there's all kinds of negative, feelings in there as well. So you present the very best of humanity into AI rather than what we are.
Well, part of that goes back to, I was consulting for the Army, U.S. Army back in the early 80s and later this century for the Navy, U.S. Navy. But in the consulting for the Army, we were at the Army War College, which is like the graduate school from West Point. And we presented this idea for a system in the helmets of soldiers. We called it Samurai, which would be a feedback loop, which would sense the person's feelings, including terror, panic, courage, sense of low self-esteem, whatever, and would then whisper in the ear what, Mind Magic would say about that situation. In the back of Mind Magic, there's a section where you can look up what terrible feeling you have.
Yeah.
And then it takes you to page 93, and that's here's how to deal with that. So it was Mind Magic turned into a feedback
in the
loop.
helmet.
Yeah. So they liked it, but they didn't do it.
Yeah.
But that's what would lie ahead. Ideally would be a feedback loop for people that would detect feelings of worthlessness or envy or, any kind of bad feelings, and would attempt to alchemy actually in Hermetic philosophy was about changing those negative feelings into positive feelings. It wasn't really about converting metallurgic. But anyway,
finding the gold. Yeah, I can see how that would apply. Now I want to sort of bring this back to our audience and the work we do at Casual. The what we've talked about just now sounds quite like Fortune 500. It sounds quite expensive. Okay. I'd love to talk a little bit around, because you've done this for some smaller clients, haven't you? I think we talked about math tuition, or, it doesn't have to be mega budget stuff when you're applying this. That, if we wanted our audience in internal comms or looking at applying this, in more HR settings or, inside a brand, this could still apply, right?
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, the RMT part of the thing is inexpensive compared to other methods. Other methods rely on getting a sample of people to do something, whether it's brainwaves or questionnaires, or you're buying data from somebody. Like people are selling their set-top box data now. Comcast could be $50 million a year to get Comcast set-top box data. Or if you want Circana's purchase data for a given brand, it could be $6 million a year. Or RMT doesn't cost anything like that. It's a very low cost method compared to other marketing methods.
Yeah, so it's accessible, and when you're thinking about an internal audience within a brand, you can understand how, so if I think about practical application, say we were producing a new employee value proposition film, we could come up with that creative. We could then run that through RMT and see which part of the organization that will resonate with, and start to map clusters within the organization to really kind of bring them on board.
Absolutely. And in Canada, we're partnering with a nonprofit that is used by almost all marketers in Canada called Vividata. And Vividata corresponds to, like, in the US, MRI is the closest correlate. They do large questionnaire, ask 60,000 data points. The sample size is like 45,000 respondents each wave, 2 waves a year. And RMT is now part of that. So anybody who's a Vivid Data subscriber can use whatever tool they're using. There are like 3 or 4 different companies, including Vivid Data themselves, that supply self-service platforms. So you can just go in and say, well, what are the need states and the motivations of my heavy users? So what about the people who are just occasional users? What about the people who use, let's say I'm L'Oreal. What about my competition, my Pantene competition? People who use both L'Oreal and Pantene, what are their need states and how's that different? And how do I reach those people that have introspection as a need state? Because I have a commercial that's kind of about that. I don't know, where to place it. So Vivid Data, which is also very modestly priced compared to, the TV currency from Numerous. It's much less expensive than Numerous in Canada. And we're looking to do this in many countries. We're in the U.S. and Canada now, but one of our partners, Samasio, which is now owned by Samba, is operating in 71 countries. So we expect to be operating in 71 countries as soon as possible.
Yeah. Because are we quite neurologically similar across cultures, or is it that's a kind of leveler in a way?
Well, if you talk to Michael Platt about that, he'll say the human race is, from a brain standpoint, identical. Culture doesn't affect it. And he would also say that it's pretty constant across primates. He's done a lot of his work with other species, and birds and things have similar brain patterns in terms of motivations of stimuli that relate to social status and sexuality and so on and so forth. So when you get down to the neurological level, we're not as differentiated as we seem to be on the surface.
No, we like to think so, though. And I think that leads quite nicely into my next question. When we initially spoke, I was talking about how difficult it can be to bring people on this journey to think about the subconscious and understand. And you said it's hard to get people to change their mental underwear, which I loved. But what do you think the actual resistance is? Why do people struggle to adopt this idea of effectiveness?
I think there's multiple reasons. I mean, I've had friends who tell me that they're frightened by what they are going to discover when they find their true selves, and they would rather not go there.
Rather live in a bubble. Yeah, I get that.
Yeah, like they know who they are now. It may be their ego self. They may know that they're egotistical, but it's all working. They've reached an equilibrium state where they're not unhappy with their lives. It's working out. Why screw with it?
Yeah.
But then there's other people who are miserably unhappy, but they're apathetic. They've given up. They don't believe in themselves. They don't believe they're going to be able to do it. And then they'll have one more thing to hate themselves for if they try to do it and fail. Like, these other people read your book and now they're successful, and I read your book and I'm still not successful. I knew I was not going to be able to do it. So there are different categories of resistance. But I'd say that for the most part, people aren't aware. 99% of the people in the world are not aware of my book, Mind Magic, and the new book out now called Powerful Mind. Powerful Mind is an attempt to be as stylistically different from Mind Magic as possible while conveying the same information. So Mind Magic, kind of looks like poetry.
Yes. Yeah. The way it's written. Yeah.
It's got kind of a sense of humor in there, and it doesn't put a lot of context, like historical context. It doesn't say this idea goes back to these roots and you may have come across this, in these other places. and these other popular writers have actually talked about it, where powerful mind goes all the other direction to put context around the same ideas, make people more comfortable that it isn't so mystical. It's kind of down to earth. Cognitive psychology, behavioral psychology, they exist. They overlap a lot. Some of these things, I find that some of the people who read Mind Magic back in the 70s are now cognitive psychologists writing their own books.
Right. Yeah.
They wrote me back then and they said, this is really good.
Yeah.
This changed my life. And now they're writing books.
And it has got a sort of cult status as well, hasn't it? Like it's really kind of like there's a real following for Mind Magic as well. I was reading even John Lennon sort of read it back in the day and sort of, was picking it up. So I do think it's got its place and has helped a lot of people as well. But I wanted to steer more towards the sort of more negative side of attention, and we've ended up in this culture at the moment. You've called it this huge psychological operations machine and social media. And we had a guest on called Imran Rashid who talked about digital junk food, and we are all driven by fear and the type of work that is being produced by these algorithms has driven us to a really negative place. Can you talk a little bit about this sort of attention as a KPI situation that's got us into where we are today?
Well, from the standpoint of classical advertising theory, attention was never the end game. Like David Ogilvy, half century ago, said, I don't write my ads to get attention. If I wanted attention, I know exactly how easy that is. I put an ad in a magazine of a gorilla wearing a jockstrap. That would get attention. For the conscious mind, it's the gatekeeper. Now, modern neuroscience knows you don't even need the conscious mind in order for the ad to have an effect. An ad can have an effect subconsciously. If you're not looking at the screen, the audio track is going into your brain. It could be predisposing you to be more willing to consider the brand. But because there was a thing called viewability, attention all of a sudden had a new relevancy to the advertising business. Because when the Media Rating Council, the MRC, discovered not only that there was a lot of fraud in advertising and bots pretending to be human beings, there was also ads that appeared on the page, but the page wasn't on the screen. So the ads weren't viewable. So they created a standard called viewability. And a guy named Noah, forget his last name, created a thing called Moat, made $1 billion because he could measure viewability. And so viewability became a thing. Well, viewability only takes you so far. What you really want to know is how many people are actually got their eyes on the ad, which has its own flaws, because the eyes on the ad is really not on the ad, it's on the skip button, as we found. Or you could be looking right through the ad on the screen. You're thinking about, as Paul Donato of the Advertising Research Foundation says, you could be thinking about the fact that you have a dentist appointment later in the day and you're not even seeing just because your eyes are pointing in that direction. Anyway, so attention became a big thing for two reasons. One, viewability kind of gave it a layup, perfect opportunity to do a dunk.
Yeah.
And billions of people suddenly were carrying around devices with cameras in them on their mobile phones where you could actually see where their eyes are pointing. Billions of people had that. So we put those two things together, all of a sudden the opportunity for attention becomes obvious to 1,000 different, garage startups and their VC backers. And so you have today, there's 40, 50 companies in the world who are in the attention business. And of course, the big platforms have all kinds of technology and walled garden information they don't share with anybody. So they jumped on it. So the whole industry jumped on it. And what they found, this is somewhat related to a mean old nasty company that went out of business called Cambridge Analytica.
Yes.
Which helped.
Responsible for quite a lot, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. The Brits leaving the EU.
Yes. Yeah.
Little things like that.
Yeah.
So there was this discovery by propaganda warfare specialists that you could use these same tools of social media for military and paramilitary purposes, political purposes, and you could also use it to make tons of money based on selling worthless or negatively impactful impressions that nobody would know that's negatively impactful. All you'd know is, look how much attention we got. Look how many impressions we got that were viewable and attentive. And so that was all exploited. And the ARF kind of ended that to some extent with their objective realizations. Wake up, industry. Attention isn't predicting sales effect. If you go back to classical advertising theory, if you go back to David Ogilvy, we knew all along that advertising didn't get sales effect or even branding effect based on pure attention. You needed more than that. You even needed more than emotion. Emotion, like you could make people happy with a funny ad that would have no sales effect. You need more than attention. You need more than emotion. You need persuasion. And what is persuasion? Persuasion is changing the perception of a brand so that it's more relevant to your subconscious motivations. Yeah. When you do that, you get a sales effect and branding effect. But to do that, you have to either accidentally stumble on relevancy to motivations or on purpose do that through a system that didn't exist until now called RMT.
Yeah, I think we've interviewed a lot of neuroscientists and behavior scientists on this show, and we've got Paul Zak measuring immersion with wearables. We've got Christopher Demetrakos looking at kind of resonance profiles with and using cluster level, and Orlando Wood is talking about focusing on the right hemisphere instead of the left. This left brain dominance that's going on. How does RMT fit into all of that? Is it the connected? Where do you think there's anything missing from the work that they're doing, or how does RMT sit within that universe of our guests? Really,
I'd say you have to put them all together to have a holistic picture. They all have a piece of the truth, and we only have a piece of the truth. It happens to be the most important piece.
So I want to sort of touch on, from Mind Magic, the flow. We're in this sort of situation where we've got information overload, and when I was younger, I grew up performing and playing music, and I completely understood when you talked about this idea of flow. Like I got it immediately. I was like, I know what that feels like. And I have now young children, busy job. It's become harder and harder. And I think, you talk about how once you become quite flooded and overloaded, it's harder to access that flow state. How are you finding flow now at 83? Do you find that it's harder to access as you get older and there's more going on? There's obviously a lot going on in your life now, but do you find it gets progressively more difficult?
The opposite. I'm finding it that I'm spending more time in flow now, and it's because I'm not attached. I'm not attached to the success of RMT. It could succeed, it could fail. Mm-hmm. Not attached to the success of the books. They could reach a lot of people or not reach a lot of people. I'm just doing what I'm here to do. I'm operating my gifts. The universe gave me these gifts. I'm using them. I'm trying to do good with them. But if they don't have a good effect, it wasn't my fault that they didn't have a good effect. I'm doing the best I can. So I'm enjoying it. And once you get into enjoying what you're doing, flow is the next it's an inch away.
I'd like to finish up with one question. We do this audience of one question at the end of every single episode. There's an idea that when you're writing something, when you're communicating something, when you're creating something, you need to have one person in your mind when you're producing work. For you, who is that person that you have in your mind when you're creating something or working on something? Who are you trying to communicate to?
Well, it would have been my parents a long time ago. It would have been for some period of my teens, a guy named Billy Harvey, who was kind of mentor in my teenage years and a large part of my young life. It might have been F. Scott Fitzgerald for decades. Nowadays, it's my wife, Lolita. It's because she's brutally honest with me and points out things that whenever I go overboard and just let whatever words come out because it pleases me. I'm the one person that I'm speaking to. She says, well, for the rest of us, you should change this line here.
Yeah. Makes it easier to digest, I suppose, as well. Yeah. Well, look, thank you very much. That's been great to have you on. We'll put links to your work in the show notes if anyone wants to find out more. But yeah, it's been a really insightful discussion. And if anyone wants to explore RMT a bit further, then they should get in touch.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Speak soon. Thanks, Bill.
If this episode sparked something, curiosity, a new way of thinking, or something you're going to take back to the team, we'd love to hear about it.
Absolutely. Make sure you're subscribed, leave us a rating, and drop us a comment. Tell us what stuck and what you want us to explore next. We want to know.
This is The Audience Connection, sponsored by Casual, the video partner for global brands trying to build trust with their audiences. We'll see you next time.